Picture this. A man walks back from the most significant military victory of his life. He has just routed 4 kings, freed his nephew, and recovered an enormous haul of plunder. And then, on the road home, he meets a stranger, a king priest from a city called Salem. And without hesitation, without any law telling him to, he hands over 10% of everything he just won. No negotiation, no second thought. The question is not just what he did. The question is why. We are in the world of Genesis 14, which places us somewhere in the early 2nd millennium BCE, in a Canaan that is a patchwork of city-states, tribal territories, and shifting alliances. Abram, whose name has not yet been changed to Abraham, is not a king. He is a wealthy pastoral chieftain who has migrated from Mesopotamia and settled in the highlands near Hebron. He commands a household large enough to field a fighting force. He is powerful by the standards of his era, but he is not a monarch. He operates in a world without a written Torah, without a Levitical priesthood, and without any formal covenant about tithes. To understand what Abram does in Genesis 14:17 through 24, you need to understand what happened in the 14 verses before it. A coalition of 4 eastern kings, identified in the text as the kings of Shinar, Elasar, Elam, and Goyim, swept through the region and defeated a coalition of 5 local kings. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were among those sacked. In the chaos, Lot, Abram's nephew who had settled near Sodom, was captured along with his household and his possessions. When Abram hears that Lot has been taken, he does not hesitate. He musters 318 trained men from his own household, a number the text gives us with striking specificity, and he pursues the 4 kings northward all the way to Dan. He launches a night raid, routs them, and chases the survivors as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. He recovers Lot's household, all the captives, and all the plunder that the eastern kings had taken from the cities of the plain. This is not a skirmish. This is a full military campaign executed by a private household. On the return journey, Abram is met by 2 very different figures in the same valley. The text names it the Valley of Shaveh, also called the King's Valley. The first figure is the king of Sodom, who comes out to meet Abram and immediately begins negotiating over the recovered goods. The second figure is Melchizedek. And here is where the passage takes a turn that has occupied biblical scholars, theologians, and careful readers for more than 2,000 years. These 2 encounters happened back to back. And the contrast between them is the whole point of the chapter. Melchizedek, 1 verse, 1 name, so much to unpack. The text introduces him in 2 phrases that are as compressed as any in the Torah. He is the king of Salem, and he is a priest of God Most High, which in the Hebrew is Elyon. That double identity, king and priest simultaneously, is unusual enough in the ancient Near East that it would have registered immediately to any careful reader. In Israel's later tradition, kings and priests were separate offices. Melchizedek holds both at once, and the text offers no explanation, no genealogy, no backstory. Salem. Scholars have long identified Salem with Jerusalem, a connection that appears explicitly in Psalm 76:2, where Salem and Zion are used in parallel. The name Salem comes from the Hebrew root for peace, shalom. So the king of Salem is, in a very literal sense, the king of peace, a detail that the author of Hebrews in the New Testament will later press hard. But in Genesis 14, the identification is simply given. Melchizedek rules Salem. He is a priest of Elyon, and he comes out to meet Abram carrying bread and wine. Bread and wine. The detail is brief, but it lands with weight. Melchizedek does not come to negotiate. He does not come to claim a share of the plunder. He brings provisions, a gesture of hospitality and honor in the ancient Near East. And then he does something even more significant. He blesses Abram. The blessing has two parts. First, he blesses Abram in the name of Elyon, the possessor of heaven and earth. Second, he blesses Elyon himself, crediting God with delivering Abram's enemies into his hand. The military victory is reframed. It was not Abram's strategy. It was God's gift. And then, immediately after the blessing, Abram gave him a tenth of everything. The Hebrew is terse and direct. There is no deliberation described, no calculation, no request from Melchizedek. Abram acts. This is the first appearance of a tithe in the entire biblical canon. Not a law, not a command, not a tax. A voluntary act of recognition. Abram has just heard a priest declare that Elyon, the possessor of heaven and earth, handed his enemies to him. And his response is to give back a tenth of what that victory produced. Now, here is a detail that matters enormously and that gets glossed over in most popular treatments of this passage. What exactly was the tenth from? Multiple commentaries are careful to specify that Abram gives a tenth of the war spoils, the plunder he recovered from the 4 eastern kings, not from his own standing wealth. This is not Abram writing a check from his savings account. Genesis 13 already tells us Abram was very rich in livestock, silver, and gold. That wealth is untouched here. The tenth comes specifically from the goods he captured in battle. And there is a further layer to this. The plunder that Abram recovered did not originally belong to him. It belonged to the people of Sodom and the neighboring cities who had been raided. Abram went after it to rescue Lot, not to enrich himself. So when he gives a tenth to Melchizedek, he is giving a portion of goods that he won in battle, but that were never really his to begin with. The voluntary nature of this act becomes even more striking when you hold that fact in your hand. He is giving away a tenth of something. He could have argued he had no obligation to give it all. Why does Abram do it? The most direct answer the text gives us is the blessing itself. Melchizedek has just declared that Elyon, the possessor of heaven and earth, is the one who delivered Abram's enemies into his hand. That framing changes everything about how Abram relates to the spoils. If God is the possessor of heaven and earth, then the plunder in Abram's hands is not a trophy of his own military genius. It is a gift held in trust. The tenth he gives back is an acknowledgement of that reality. It is worship expressed through economics. There is a theological precision in Melchizedek's language that is easy to miss in translation. He does not say God helped Abram win. He says God delivered your enemies into your hand. The passive construction places Abram in the role of recipient, not agent. Abram did not conquer. He was given a conquest. And the tithe is Abram's way of saying out loud, with goods rather than words, that he understands the difference. This is not a man paying dues. This is a man making a theological statement about who actually owns the outcome of his life. Now look at what happens immediately after the tithe. The king of Sodom steps forward and makes his pitch. He tells Abram to give him the people, the captives, and keep the goods for himself. And Abram refuses. He refuses everything. He will not take so much as a sandal strap from the king of Sodom, and he says so explicitly. His stated reason is this: he does not want the king of Sodom to be able to say that he made Abram rich. The contrast with the tithe to Melchizedek is the entire architecture of the passage. One king gets a tenth, the other king gets nothing. This contrast is not accidental. The author of Genesis 14 has structured the chapter so that these two encounters read as a single argument. Abram gives a tenth to the priest of Elyon and refuses everything from the king of Sodom. In doing so, he draws a line between two sources of wealth and two sources of identity. He is willing to acknowledge that God gave him the victory, and he marks that acknowledgement with 10% of the spoils. He is not willing to let a corrupt king take credit for his prosperity. The tithe and the refusal are two sides of the same coin. You will not find this one on a Sunday school poster. The king of Sodom is one of the most quietly important figures in this chapter, precisely because of what he represents. He is not portrayed as overtly evil in this scene. He is simply a transactional king, making a reasonable business offer. Give me the people, keep the goods. It is a fair deal by any ancient Near Eastern standard. But Abram's refusal signals that he is operating by a completely different logic, one that the tithe to Melchizedek has already established. He is not in the market for a human patron. He already has one. Let us talk about Elyon as a divine name, because it matters for understanding what Melchizedek represents. Elyon, God Most High, appears in this passage as the name used by both Melchizedek and then by Abram himself when he responds to the king of Sodom. Abram swears by Elyon, the possessor of heaven and earth, using the same title Melchizedek used. This is significant. Abram is not correcting Melchizedek's theology. He is adopting it. He identifies the God of Melchizedek with his own God. Why HWH? The two men share a theological framework even though they come from different backgrounds. The question of who Melchizedek is has generated an enormous amount of scholarly and theological discussion over more than 2 millennia. The text gives us almost nothing. No father, no mother, no genealogy, no origin story, no death. He appears, he blesses, he receives a tithe, and he vanishes from the narrative. The silence around him is so complete that later interpreters could not leave it alone. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain a text known as 11Q Melchizedek, a fragmentary document that portrays Melchizedek as a heavenly figure, an exalted being who executes divine judgment. The Qumran community found his mystery irresistible. Psalm 110 is the other major Old Testament text that picks up Melchizedek's name. It is addressed to a royal figure and contains the line, "You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." This is a remarkable claim. The psalmist is invoking Melchizedek as the model for a perpetual, non-Levitical priesthood. He is not a one-time curiosity. He is a category, a type of priest that exists outside the normal Israelite institutional framework. When you understand that, you begin to see why the author of Hebrews in the New Testament spends an entire chapter, chapter 7, working through the implications of Abraham's 10%. Hebrews chapter 7 is where the New Testament takes Abraham's tithe and uses it to make an argument about priestly hierarchy. The logic goes like this. Abraham gave a tenth to Melchizedek. The Levitical priests, who later collect tithes from Israel, are descended from Abraham. Therefore, in a sense, the Levitical priesthood itself paid tithes to Melchizedek through their ancestor. The argument is dense and very specific to its rhetorical context, but the foundation of the entire argument is that single act in Genesis 14. One voluntary tithe, given on a road in Canaan, becomes the cornerstone of a theological case about the nature of priesthood. The author of Hebrews also presses hard on Melchizedek's missing genealogy. He describes him as without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life. This is not a claim that Melchizedek was literally without parents. It is an argument from silence in the text. In the Torah, priestly legitimacy was established through genealogy. If you cannot trace your lineage through Levi and Aaron, you cannot serve as a priest. But Melchizedek has no recorded lineage, and yet functions as a priest of the highest order. His priesthood is validated not by descent, but by divine declaration. Back to Genesis, because there is a canonical timeline point worth being precise about. This tithe happens before the Mosaic Law, before Sinai, before the covenant at Horeb, before Leviticus 27:30 through 33 formally defines the tithe as a tenth of agricultural produce and livestock belonging to the Lord, before Numbers 18 assigns the tithe to the Levites as their inheritance. Abram's act in Genesis 14 is pre-legal in every sense. There is no command. There is no statute. There is no penalty for not tithing. He simply does it. And that voluntariness is part of what makes the act theologically legible as worship rather than tax compliance. There is a second tithe story in Genesis that most people do not connect to this one. In Genesis 28:20 through 22, Jacob, Abraham's grandson, makes a vow at Bethel. He promises that if God watches over him and brings him back safely, then the Lord will be his God, and he will give a tenth of everything God gives him. Jacob is following a pattern. He has heard about what his grandfather did on the road back from battle. The practice of giving a tenth as an act of acknowledgement and consecration is being transmitted within the family before it ever becomes law. It travels through story before it travels through statute. The trajectory from Genesis 14 to Leviticus 27 to Numbers 18 is worth tracing because it shows how a voluntary act becomes an institutionalized practice and then becomes law. Abram gives a tenth voluntarily as worship. Jacob vows a tenth as a conditional promise. By the time of the Mosaic covenant, the tithe is codified as a legal obligation with specific categories: agricultural produce, livestock, and later a second tithe for festivals and a third-year tithe for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. What begins as one man's spontaneous act of gratitude becomes the economic backbone of an entire religious and social system. It is worth pausing on the bread and wine that Melchizedek brings out, because later interpretive traditions have found a great deal in that detail. The author of Hebrews does not mention the bread and wine at all, but Christian interpreters from the early centuries of the Common Era read the bread and wine as a prefiguring of the Eucharist, a priestly offering of the elements that would later become central to Christian liturgy. Whether or not you find that reading persuasive, it tells you something important about how seriously later readers took every detail of this brief encounter. Nothing in Genesis 14 was treated as incidental. Let us think carefully about the phrase King of Salem, because the geography matters. Salem, identified with Jerusalem, sits in the central highlands of Canaan. Abram himself is based near Hebron, also in the highlands. The Valley of Shaveh, where the encounter takes place, is associated in later texts with the Kidron Valley near Jerusalem. So, this is not a chance meeting on a distant road. Melchizedek is the ruler of the nearest significant city to where Abram has been living. He is not a stranger from a foreign land in the way we might imagine. He is the king of the city on the hill that Abram can see from his encampment. The question of whether Melchizedek was a Canaanite king who worshiped the same God as Abram, or a mysterious figure of a different order entirely, has divided interpreters for centuries. The most straightforward reading of the text is that Elyon was a divine name used in the Canaanite religious world of the early second millennium, and that Abram recognized it as referring to his own God. This is not a syncretistic compromise on Abram's part. It is a recognition that the God he follows is not a tribal deity confined to his own household. Elyon, the possessor of heaven and earth, is a universal claim. There is a practical dimension to the tithe that gets overlooked in purely theological readings. Abram has just returned from a military campaign that took him hundreds of miles north and back. He has recovered a large quantity of goods. He is about to be approached by the king of Sodom with a claim on those goods by giving a tenth to Melchizedek first. Before the negotiation with Sodom begins, Abram is also making a public statement about his priorities. The tithe is not just a private act of worship. It is a public act performed in a valley where both kings are present. It is witnessed. It is declarative. The refusal of Sodom's goods deserves its own close reading because Abram's language is precise. He says he has lifted his hand to Elyon, the possessor of heaven and earth, and sworn that he will not take so much as a thread or a sandal strap from the king of Sodom. The oath invokes the same divine title Melchizedek used. Abram is saying, in effect, that his allegiance has already been declared. He gave 10% to the priest of Elyon. He is not now going to accept enrichment from a king whose city he just helped rescue. The two acts are logically and theologically connected. One more detail worth noting. Abram does make an exception in his refusal of Sodom's goods. He says that his allies, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, who fought alongside him, should receive their share. He is not imposing his own theology on the men who helped him win. His vow is personal. His refusal is personal. He will not take anything for himself, but he will not prevent others from taking their portion. This is a subtle but important distinction. The tithe and the refusal are Abram's own acts of conviction, not a policy he enforces on everyone around him. The canonical placement of Genesis 14 is also worth considering. It sits between the account of Lot's separation from Abram in chapter 13 and the covenant of the pieces in chapter 15, where God makes his formal promise to Abram about land and descendants. The Melchizedek episode is not a detour. It is a pivot point. Abram has demonstrated through the campaign to rescue Lot and through the tithe and the refusal that he operates by a different set of loyalties than the kings around him. Chapter 15 then opens with God telling Abram, "Do not be afraid. I'm your shield and your very great reward." The reward Abram refused from Sodom, God offers directly. The Dead Sea Scrolls text 11Q Melchizedek, discovered at Qumran and dated to the 1st century BCE, shows how far the interpretive tradition around this figure had traveled by the Second Temple period. In that text, Melchizedek is a celestial redeemer figure who presides over a heavenly court, proclaims liberty to captives, and executes judgment on the wicked. He is identified with the divine figure called Elohim in Psalm 82, and with the anointed one of Isaiah 61. This is a long way from the brief appearance in Genesis 14, but it shows that the Qumran community was reading the same silence in the text that the author of Hebrews would later read, and filling it with cosmic significance. Hebrews chapter 7 is the New Testament's most sustained engagement with Genesis 14, and is worth understanding what argument it is actually making. The author is writing to a community that is deeply invested in the Levitical priesthood as the legitimate channel of access to God. He wants to argue that Jesus holds a priesthood of a higher order. His evidence is Melchizedek. The argument runs, Melchizedek received tithes from Abraham. The Levitical priests are Abraham's descendants. Therefore, Melchizedek's priesthood is superior to the Levitical priesthood. And since Jesus is a priest after the order of Melchizedek, his priesthood supersedes the Levitical system entirely. What is remarkable about the Hebrews argument is how much theological weight it places on a single transaction that takes up 3 verses in Genesis. The author of Hebrews is not inventing a new tradition. He is reading the text with the same intensity that the Qumran community read it, and the same intensity that the rabbinical tradition brought to it. Every silence in the Melchizedek account, the missing genealogy, the missing death, the missing origin, becomes a data point. The text says nothing about his beginning or end, and that silence is treated as significant rather than incidental. This is a man the Bible remembered and history forgot. Let us fix that. Let us also be honest about what the text does not tell us. It does not tell us whether Melchizedek knew who Abram was before this meeting. It does not tell us whether the 2 men had any prior relationship. It does not explain how Melchizedek came to be a priest of Elyon in a Canaanite city. It does not tell us what happened to him after this encounter. Biblical scholarship has proposed various theories, including that Salem was a pre-Israelite religious center with its own Elyon cult, and that Melchizedek was a historical king priest in that tradition. But the text itself is silent on all of these questions, and that silence is part of the data. Every name in that text was somebody's whole life. Melchizedek appears for 3 verses in the Torah, surfaces in 1 line of Psalm 110, gets a chapter in Hebrews, and generates a major document among the Dead Sea Scrolls. He is one of the most theologically significant minor figures in the entire biblical canon. And the event that launches all of that interpretive tradition is a voluntary act of giving 10% of war spoils on a road in Canaan by a man who had no law requiring it to a priest king he had just met, because a blessing had just reframed everything he thought he had earned. That is the whole story, and it is a remarkable one. If this episode has stayed with you, I want to point you toward 2 places in the text worth reading back to back. Read Genesis 14 in full, all 24 verses, and then read Hebrews chapter 7. The distance between those 2 texts is roughly 1,500 years of literary and theological history, and the thread connecting them is 1 man giving 10% of battle plunder to a stranger on a road. That is what this channel is for. The figures who get 3 verses and somehow anchor centuries of thought. If you found this useful, subscribe, leave a comment with the obscure biblical figure you want me to cover next, and I will see you in the next one.